In the summer of 1884, the Arizona Territory was a land that tested the limits of human endurance. It was a place where the sun could kill you as surely as a bullet, where water was more precious than gold, and where the nearest neighbor might be a day's hard ride away. Men came to this unforgiving wilderness, chasing dreams of copper and silver, of land ownership and fresh starts. Most left broken, defeated by the relentless heat and the crushing isolation. But some stayed, carved out lives from the red earth and endless sky, learned to find beauty in the harsh geometry of sagebrush and stone. Sarah McKenna had been one of those who stayed. At 24, she possessed the kind of quiet strength that frontier life demanded. The ability to birth calves in the middle of the night, to stretch a pound of flour into a week's worth of bread, to stand on her porch at dawn and see possibility in a landscape that looked like the end of the world. She had arrived in the territory 3 years earlier as a bride, following her husband Thomas west from the green hills of Ohio to this place where the horizon stretched unbroken in every direction. Their homestead sat 40 miles northeast of Tucson, a modest collection of buildings that represented everything they had worked for and dreamed of. The house itself was small but solid, built from local stone and timber that Thomas had hauled from the mountains. Every board had been measured twice, every nail driven with the care of a man who understood that in this climate there was no room for shoddy workmanship. The roof was steep enough to shed the occasional rain, but low enough to withstand the constant wind. Windows faced east and west to catch the morning light and evening breezes, while the thick walls provided blessed coolness during the brutal midday hours. Behind the house stood a barn that housed their few animals, 2 horses, a milk cow, and a small flock of chickens that provided eggs and the occasional Sunday dinner. A windmill creaked steadily in the distance, its blades turning lazily in the desert air as it drew precious water from deep beneath the earth. Sarah had learned to read the wind's moods, to know when a storm was coming by the way the blades changed their rhythm. It was one of 100 small skills that separated those who thrived in the territory from those who merely survived. The land itself was deceptive in its beauty. What looked like barren wasteland to Eastern eyes was actually a complex ecosystem that supported life in ways both obvious and subtle. Prickly pear cactus bloomed in brilliant yellow flowers each spring, their fruit providing sustenance for both animals and humans. Creosote bushes dotted the landscape in regular patterns, their roots extending deep into the earth to tap hidden sources of moisture. And everywhere, the desert grass grew in sparse but persistent clumps, providing just enough forage for the cattle that represented the McKenna's modest prosperity. Thomas McKenna had been a good man, though not necessarily a practical one. A former school teacher from Columbus, he had possessed the kind of restless intelligence that found the routine of classroom instruction stifling. He had read every book he could find about Western mining, had studied geological surveys and mineral rights with the dedication of a scholar. When the opportunity arose to join a mining operation in the Arizona Territory, he had convinced Sarah to leave everything familiar behind and chase his dream of striking it rich in the copper mines that dotted the landscape south of their homestead. The work was dangerous, backbreaking, and poorly paid, but Thomas had approached it with the same methodical enthusiasm he had once brought to teaching arithmetic and grammar. He would return home each evening covered in red dust, his hands scarred and calloused, but his eyes bright with the possibility that tomorrow might be the day they hit the vein that would change everything. Sarah had learned to read the signs in his face, the set of his shoulders that told her whether it had been a good day or a difficult one, the way he held his coffee cup that revealed whether he was hopeful or discouraged. But it wasn't just the mind that defined Thomas McKenna. He was a man who noticed things. The way morning light fell across the kitchen table, the sound Sarah made when she was concentrating on her sewing, the particular call of the roadrunner that nested near their well. He had built their furniture by hand, not because they couldn't afford to buy it, but because he wanted everything in their home to be made with love and intention. The rocking chair on the porch had been his wedding gift to Sarah, crafted from wood he had selected and seasoned himself. Every curve of its arms, every slat of its back had been shaped by hands that understood the difference between building something and creating something. Their marriage had been one of those rare partnerships where two people genuinely liked each other as much as they loved each other. They had weathered the challenges of frontier life together, the loneliness, the financial uncertainty, the constant awareness that they were just one accident or illness away from disaster. They had lost their first pregnancy during the brutal winter of 1882, had held each other through the grief and found the strength to hope again. When Sarah had missed her monthly time in March of 1884, they had kept the news to themselves, afraid to tempt fate with premature celebration. The mining operation Thomas worked for was typical of the small-scale ventures that dotted the territory. The Southwest Copper Company employed about 30 men, most of them immigrants from Ireland, Mexico, and Germany, who had come west seeking the same elusive prosperity that had drawn the McKennas. The work was organized around a network of shafts and tunnels that followed the veins of copper ore deep into the earth. It was dangerous work, even under the best circumstances. Cave-ins, gas explosions, and equipment failures were constant threats. But the men who did it were bound together by the kind of camaraderie that develops when you trust your life to the person working beside you. Jake Morrison had been Thomas's partner in the mine for almost 2 years. At 38, he was older than most of the miners, a man who had come to the territory not to chase dreams, but to escape memories. He had been married once to a woman named Mary, who had died of cholera along with their infant son during the epidemic of 1879. The loss had changed him in ways that went deeper than grief, had stripped away the parts of himself that believed in planning for the future, in building something permanent, in the possibility of happiness. But if tragedy had made Jake Morrison cautious about hope, it had also made him extraordinarily skilled at recognizing pain in others. He had an instinct for knowing when someone needed space and when they needed company, when words would help and when silence was the only gift that mattered. It was this quality that had made him such a good partner for Thomas, whose enthusiastic nature sometimes required the steadying influence of someone who understood that the earth didn't always cooperate with human ambition. The two men had developed the kind of friendship that exists between people who have seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay. Jake had been there during the difficult days after Sarah's miscarriage, had listened to Thomas's fears about whether they would ever have children, had shared the joy when Thomas confided that Sarah was expecting again. In return, Thomas had provided Jake with something he hadn't realized he was missing, the vicarious pleasure of watching someone else believe in the future, the warmth of being included in plans and dreams, and the small domestic happiness of a stable marriage. On the morning of June 15, 1884, Jake Morrison woke in the company bunkhouse with the peculiar sense of unease that sometimes precedes disaster. It was nothing he could articulate. The sun rose at its usual time, the coffee tasted the same, the other miners went about their morning routines with typical efficiency. But something in the quality of the light, or the way the wind carried the sound of the steam engines, made him feel as though the world had shifted slightly on its axis. He found Thomas already at work, examining the wooden supports in the deepest section of their assigned tunnel. The mine had been producing well lately, the copper ore running rich and clean, but the deeper they went, the more unstable the surrounding rock became. Jake had suggested they slow down, take more time to reinforce the ceiling, but the company foreman was pushing for increased production. "Morning, Jake," Thomas called out, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Take a look at this formation. I think we might be close to something big." Jake joined his partner, studying the wall of rock that gleamed with veins of green and blue mineral. Thomas was right. The signs suggested they were approaching a major deposit. But Jake's experienced eye also saw the hairline cracks in the ceiling, the way the support beams were beginning to bow under the weight of thousands of tons of stone. "We need to shore this up before we go any deeper," Jake said, running his hand along one of the wooden braces. "This whole section is talking to us." Thomas nodded, understanding the miner's vocabulary that described the sounds and movements that preceded a cave-in. "We'll reinforce after lunch, but Jake, if we're right about this vein, it could change everything. Sarah and we could finally have that security we've been working toward." Those were the last words Jake would ever hear his friend speak. 20 minutes later, as Thomas worked to extract a sample of ore from the promising vein, a section of ceiling gave way with a sound like thunder. Jake had been working 30 feet away, close enough to feel the rush of air and dust, too far away to do anything but watch in horror as tons of rock buried the man who had become the closest thing to a brother he'd ever had. The rescue took 6 hours. By the time they reached Thomas's body, Jake knew with the terrible certainty that comes from experience that his friend was gone. The mine foreman would file his report, the company would send a letter of condolence, and somewhere in the distance, a woman would receive news that would change her life forever. As Jake rode slowly toward the McKenna homestead, the sun beginning its descent toward the western mountains, he carried with him not just the weight of terrible news, but the knowledge that he was about to witness the moment when someone's world ended. He thought about Sarah, about the child she carried, about the rocking chair on the porch where she would sit to watch for her husband's return. He thought about the promise he had made to Thomas just a week earlier, a casual conversation about looking after each other's families that had seemed hypothetical at the time. But most of all, he thought about the difference between the words that people expected to hear in moments of crisis and the kind of presence that actually mattered. Jake Morrison had learned through bitter experience that sometimes the most profound gift you can offer someone is not the promise that everything will be all right, but simply the refusal to let them face their darkest hour alone. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and brutal and indifferent to human suffering. But in the gathering dusk, as Jake approached the small homestead where a woman waited for news that would never come, he carried with him the knowledge that even in the loneliest places, no one has to face the night alone. The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under the merciless June sun, its red earth cracked like broken promises. Sarah McKenna sat on the weathered porch of her small homestead, her calloused hands gripping the wooden rail until her knuckles turned white. The letter lay crumpled at her feet, its words still burning in her mind like a brand on cattle hide. "Regret to inform you that your husband, Thomas McKenna, was killed in a mining accident. No survivors. Deepest condolences." The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and the distant sound of cattle lowing. But Sarah heard nothing, felt nothing except the crushing weight of a future that had just collapsed like a mine shaft. 3 months pregnant and alone on 40 acres of unforgiving land, she stared at the horizon where heat waves danced like ghosts. She didn't notice the rider approaching until his shadow fell across the porch. Jake Morrison, dismounted his bay mare with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent more years in the saddle than on solid ground. His weathered face, marked by sun and wind, carried the kind of quiet strength that came from surviving hard places and harder times. "Sarah," he said simply, his voice rough from years of dust and silence. He'd been Thomas's friend, his partner in the copper mine 40 miles south. Now he stood there, hat in hand, his blue eyes reflecting something she couldn't quite name. "I don't want to hear it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want condolences. I don't want promises that everything will be fine. I don't want anyone telling me God has a plan." Jake nodded slowly, understanding flooding his weathered features. He'd lost his own wife and child to cholera 5 years prior. He knew the hollow ache that made well-meaning words feel like stones thrown at glass. "I'm not here to say any of that," he replied, settling his hat back on his head. "I'm here because Thomas asked me to look after you if anything happened to him." Sarah's laugh was bitter as desert wind. "Look after me. I'm not cattle to be tended, Jake Morrison. I'm a grown woman who can—" Her voice cracked, and she turned away, pressing her face against the porch post. Jake stood there for a moment, watching her shoulders shake with the effort of holding back tears she wouldn't let fall. Then, without a word, he walked to the edge of the porch and sat down on the steps, not close enough to intrude, but close enough to be present. He pulled out a piece of carved wood and his whittling knife, the familiar ritual of his hands, beginning their quiet work. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, her voice muffled. "Sitting," he replied simply, shavings falling to the dusty ground. "Why?" "Because you shouldn't be alone right now." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes red-rimmed and fierce. "I told you, I don't want—" "I know what you said," Jake interrupted gently. "You don't want words, so I'm not giving you any. I'm just here." The silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Sarah wanted to order him to leave, to saddle up and ride back to wherever he came from. But something in his posture, in the way he sat without expectation or demand, made her hesitate. The sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Jake's knife moved rhythmically against the wood, creating something beautiful from something rough. Sarah found herself drawn to the sound, to the steady presence of someone who understood that sometimes the greatest gift wasn't words of comfort, but simply the refusal to let someone face their darkest hour alone. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah realized that for the first time since receiving the letter, she could breathe. Dawn broke over the desert with the subtlety of a gunshot, all harsh light and unforgiving heat. Sarah had barely slept, her mind churning with questions that had no answers and a future that seemed as barren as the landscape around her. When she stepped onto the porch, cup of weak coffee in hand, she found Jake exactly where she'd left him the night before. He sat on the porch steps, his back against the post, hat pulled low over his eyes. For a moment she thought he might be sleeping, but then she noticed the steady rise and fall of his chest, the alert way he held his head, despite the relaxed pose. "You stayed all night," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Figured you might need to know someone was here," he replied, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him without being asked. "Coyotes were singing pretty loud around midnight." Sarah knew he meant more than just the four-legged kind. The territory was full of men who preyed on vulnerability, who saw a woman alone as an opportunity rather than a person in pain. She'd been too lost in her grief to think of such practical dangers, but Jake had been thinking for both of them. "You can't just sit on my porch indefinitely," she said, settling into the rocking chair Thomas had built for her during their first winter together. The wood was smooth from use, worn to a comfortable familiarity that made her chest ache. "Why not?" Jake asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than argumentative. Because people will talk. Because you have your own life to live. Because I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." Jake took a sip of coffee and nodded thoughtfully. "All true, but Thomas made me promise to look after you, and I keep my promises. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I've got nowhere else to be." The day passed in a strange rhythm. Jake helped with the morning chores without being asked, feeding the chickens and checking the water pump, while Sarah tried to make sense of the papers Thomas had left behind. Financial documents, property deeds, letters from the mining company, all of it a maze of legal language that made her head spin. "I don't understand any of this," she finally admitted, as the afternoon heat grew oppressive. "Thomas handled all the business dealings. I don't even know how much money we have or what debts we owe." Jake, who had been repairing a loose board on the porch, looked up from his work. "Would you like me to look at them? I had to learn about such things after Mary died." Sarah hesitated. Accepting help felt like admitting weakness, like confirming that she couldn't manage on her own. But the papers seemed to mock her with their complexity, and she was too tired to wrestle with pride. "Would you?" she asked quietly. For the next hour, Jake sorted through the documents with the methodical patience of a man who understood that details mattered. He explained each paper in simple terms, showed her where Thomas had recorded their expenses and income, helped her understand that while their situation was challenging, it wasn't hopeless. "You've got enough saved to get through the winter if you're careful," he said finally. "And the land is worth something if you decide to sell." "I won't sell," Sarah said immediately. "This is home. Thomas and I, we built this together." Jake nodded, understanding. "Then we'll figure out how to make it work." "We. You," he corrected gently. "I'll help you figure out how to make it work." As evening approached, Sarah found herself watching Jake's steady presence with something approaching wonder. He didn't try to fill the silence with empty conversation or distract her from her grief. Instead, he simply existed alongside her pain, neither trying to fix it nor running from it. "Why?" she asked suddenly, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple. "Why are you really here? And don't say it's because of a promise to Thomas." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his hands still working on the piece of wood he'd been carving. "Because I know what it's like to face the dark alone," he said finally. "And I know what it's like to have someone sit with you in it. Mary's sister stayed with me for 3 days after I buried them. Didn't say much, just sat. It made the difference between surviving and not surviving." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but this time she didn't fight them. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," Jake replied, "but scared isn't the same as broken, and you're not alone." The night sounds of the desert began their ancient chorus, and Sarah realized that the crushing weight in her chest had shifted slightly. Not gone, but bearable. For the first time since the letter had arrived, she allowed herself to hope that tomorrow might be possible. The third day dawned gray and threatened rain, unusual for the Arizona Territory in June. Sarah woke to the sound of hammering and found Jake on the roof, replacing shingles that had been damaged in the last storm. He worked with quiet efficiency, his movements economical and sure. "You don't have to do that," she called up to him. "Roof needs fixing," he replied without stopping his work. "Rain's coming." Sarah looked at the gathering clouds and felt a flicker of anxiety. She'd never weathered a storm alone on the homestead. Thomas had always been there to check the animals, secure the shutters, ensure their small world remained safe and dry. As if reading her thoughts, Jake climbed down from the roof and began checking the shutters on the windows. "Storm will pass through tonight," he said matter-of-factly. "Might be a rough one, but the house is solid." Thomas built it to last. The mention of her husband's name no longer sent Sarah reeling. Instead, she felt a warm glow of pride. Thomas had been a good man, a builder who thought of the future even when the present was hard enough. "He was going to add a room," she said, gesturing to the east side of the house, "for the baby." Jake paused in his work, and Sarah realized it was the first time she'd mentioned the child growing inside her. The pregnancy had been their secret, something they'd planned to announce after the dangerous first months had passed. "Boy or girl?" Jake asked gently. "Too early to tell, but Thomas was convinced it would be a boy. Said he could feel it." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her still flat stomach. "I think he was just hoping for someone to help with the heavy work." Jake smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Thomas never was much for manual labor, smart as a whip, but he couldn't nail 2 boards together without hitting his thumb. Despite everything, Sarah found herself laughing. "You should have seen him trying to build the chicken coop. I finally had to take the hammer away from him before he hurt himself. I remember that coop, lopsided as a drunk man's walk, but those chickens didn't seem to mind." The afternoon passed in a haze of shared memories and quiet companionship. Jake told her stories about Thomas from their days working together, painting a picture of her husband as others saw him. Generous, determined, always ready with a joke when the work got hard. "He talked about you constantly," Jake said as they sat on the porch watching the storm clouds gather. "Used to drive the other miners crazy. Sarah says this, Sarah thinks that. But we all knew how much he loved you. Sarah felt tears threaten again, but this time they weren't born of despair. I loved him too, more than I thought it was possible to love another person. I know, Jake said simply. It shows in everything you built together. The first drops of rain began to fall as evening approached, fat droplets that kicked up small puffs of dust where they hit the dry earth. Jake secured the last of the shutters and brought his horse into the small barn. You should go, Sarah said as he returned to the porch. Get home before the storm hits. Jake shook his head. My place is just a shack. Rather wait it out here if you don't mind the company. Sarah realized she didn't mind. In fact, the thought of facing the storm alone filled her with a familiar dread. There's stew on the stove, she said, and biscuits from this morning. They ate in comfortable silence as the rain began in earnest, drumming against the roof and windows with increasing intensity. Thunder rolled across the desert, and lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, stark moments. Thomas hated storms, Sarah said suddenly. He'd pace the floor like a caged animal until they passed. I remember. He'd always volunteer for the late shift when storms were coming, said he'd rather be underground than listening to the thunder. But he'd sit with me anyway, even though I could see how much it bothered him. He'd tell me stories to distract us both. Jake nodded, understanding. Love makes us brave in ways we never expected. As the storm reached its peak, Sarah found herself thinking about that word, brave. She'd never considered herself particularly courageous, but here she was, facing the biggest challenge of her life with a quiet determination that surprised her. Maybe Thomas had been right about her strength. Maybe she was braver than she knew. Jake, she said suddenly, tomorrow I want to start learning about the business, about managing the property, about everything I'll need to know. Tomorrow? He asked, surprised. Tomorrow, she confirmed. I can't stay frozen in this moment forever. I have responsibilities. To Thomas's memory, to the baby, to myself. Jake smiled, and Sarah saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten. Not with grief this time, but with something warmer. Respect, pride, the recognition of strength, acknowledging strength. Then tomorrow we'll start, he said. But tonight, we just sit with the storm. Outside, the wind howled and the rain lashed against the windows. But inside, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in days, the possibility of peace. Not the peace of endings, but of beginnings, of a future that might be different than she'd planned, but was still worth fighting for. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the desert washed clean and sparkling under a brilliant morning sun. Sarah woke to the sound of Jake chopping wood, the rhythmic thunk of the axe against cedar providing a steady soundtrack to the day's beginning. She found him by the woodpile, his shirt damp with sweat despite the early hour. He'd already stacked enough wood to last through the next winter, and she realized with a start that it had been 3 days since she'd received the letter about Thomas. 3 days that had felt like a lifetime, but also like the space between one breath and the next. You're up early, she said, bringing him a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs. Habit, he replied, accepting the food gratefully. Besides, wanted to get the heavy work done before the heat sets in. Sarah looked around the homestead with new eyes. The roof was repaired, the shutters secure, the wood chopped, and the animals tended. In 3 days, Jake had quietly addressed every maintenance issue that had been weighing on her mind, creating a foundation of security that allowed her to think beyond mere survival. I don't know how to thank you, she said. Don't need thanks, Jake replied. Just keep the promise you made last night. About learning, about moving forward. Sarah nodded, feeling a flicker of the old determination that had carried her through the challenges of frontier life. Where do we start? They spent the morning going through Thomas's business ledgers, with Jake teaching her how to read the mining company's payments, understand the costs of supplies, and project what she'd need to sustain the homestead through the coming months. Sarah proved to be a quick learner, her mind sharp despite her grief. The mine will keep making payments to Thomas's widow, Jake explained, showing her the contract. It's not much, but it's steady. And if you're careful with expenses, you can make it work. What about you? Sarah asked suddenly. Will you keep working the mine? Jake was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling on the papers. I've been thinking about that. Thomas and I had been talking about buying our own claim, working for ourselves instead of the company. There's a piece of land about 10 miles south that shows promise. You should do it, Sarah said immediately. Thomas would want you to follow that dream. Maybe, Jake said, but first I need to make sure you're settled, make sure you've got everything you need. Sarah felt a familiar protest rising in her throat, but she stopped herself. Over the past 3 days, she'd learned to recognize the difference between accepting help and surrendering independence. Jake's presence hadn't made her weak, it had made her stronger. I have a proposition, she said slowly, the idea forming even as she spoke. What if, instead of buying land 10 miles away, you considered becoming a partner here? The homestead is bigger than I can manage alone, and Thomas always said this land had potential for more than just subsistence farming. Jake looked up sharply, surprise flickering across his weathered features. Sarah, you don't have to. I'm not offering out of charity, she interrupted. I'm offering because it makes sense. You know the land, you know the business, and you've already proven you can work alongside me without trying to take over. Besides, she added with a small smile, I suspect I'm going to need all the help I can get once the baby arrives. Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. It wouldn't be proper, he said finally. People would talk. Let them talk, Sarah replied with a strength that surprised them both. I've learned something these past few days. The opinion of people who aren't willing to sit with you in the dark doesn't matter much when the sun comes up. The afternoon passed in planning and possibility. They walked the property together, discussing improvements and potential expansion. Jake showed her where water might be diverted to create better grazing, where a vegetable garden might thrive, where the land itself suggested its best use. Thomas was right about this place, Jake said as they stood on a small rise overlooking the homestead. It's got good bones, strong foundation, just needs someone willing to work with it instead of against it. Like marriage, Sarah said without thinking, then blushed at the words. Jake glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. Yeah, he said quietly, like marriage. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Sarah felt the weight of the past 3 days, settling into something like resolution. Not closure. She wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for that, but acceptance. The ability to hold grief and hope in the same moment without being crushed by the contradiction. Jake, she said as they sat on the porch, watching the day fade into night. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. All right, these 3 days, would you have stayed if Thomas hadn't asked you to look after me? Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. Then, just as she was about to tell him to forget the question, he spoke. I don't know, he said, but I'd like to think I would have, because that's what people do for each other when the world gets dark. They sit, they stay. They remind each other that morning always comes, even when you can't see it. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude, of recognition, of the profound relief that comes from realizing you're not alone in the world. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For sitting, for staying, for reminding me that I'm stronger than I thought I was. Jake smiled, and Sarah realized that this was what healing looked like, not the absence of pain, but the presence of hope. Not the forgetting of loss, but the remembering of love. Not the end of one story, but the beginning of another. So, she said, her voice stronger now, partners. Bunny Jake extended his hand, and Sarah took it, feeling the calluses and scars that spoke of hard work and honest labor. Partners, he agreed. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Sarah rocked gently in Thomas's chair, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. The baby would grow up knowing the story of their father, would learn about the man who dreamed of additions to the house and worried about storms. But they would also grow up knowing the value of presence, of sitting with someone in their darkest hour, of the quiet strength that comes from refusing to let someone face their struggles alone. The desert wind carried the scent of rain-washed earth and the promise of new growth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new reasons to be grateful for the simple act of waking up to another day. But tonight, Sarah was content to sit on her porch, no longer alone, no longer afraid, watching the ancient dance of stars above her small piece of the vast, beautiful, difficult world. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and somewhere in the darkness, an answer came. The sound no longer seemed lonely to Sarah. Instead, it sounded like what it was, a promise that even in the wildest places, even in the hardest times, no one has to face the night alone.